It is a great pleasure to be back with you and to be able to meet in person. The last 18 months have been challenging on a variety of fronts, but I can tell you that this organization has not stood still, and that we have used the last 18 months in the pandemic actually to sort of rejigger our business model, look at new areas for us to perfect, areas where we can grow, and we think we have come up with a nice balance in terms of how we provide education and advocacy on water-related issues for the entirety of Southern California. So I am pleased that we are able to get back together today. And as part of being together, I do want to make sure that I say thank you to those who make today possible. First and foremost, our lunch sponsor. If you enjoyed everything, you want to say thank you to June Lopez and members of the board of the Molten Miguel Water District who sponsored today's lunch. If there was anything wrong with your meal whatsoever, I'm sorry. Just let me know later how I can make it better. The other funders and founders of this organization I want to say thank you to, because based on their generosity really is the foundation financially for why we're able to do what we do. And that is, as you heard from the Inland Empire Utilities Agency, IUA, the Irvine Ranch Water District, Los Angeles County Department of Public Works, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Madam Gray, Chair Gray, thank you for being with us, the Riverside County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, San Bernardino County, the Water Replenishment District, and West Basin Municipal Water District. Please say thank you to all of them. So, as I mentioned, with the evolving issues in and around water, it became readily apparent that there were emerging issues that we would traditionally try to handle as, or incorporate into part of some larger issues. And every time we talked about new source development or water quality, or whether or not we started talking about Sacramento Bay Delta or Colorado River, the more we talk about various issues, the more certain things kept kind of popping up, and now it become quite timely. And so today, we formally launched a new task force as part of this organization, the Equity, Access, and Affordability Task Force. And today, we've got an expert panel to sort of talk a little bit about what does that mean? And rather than coming to the table with a predetermined agenda, position, definition, we thought, let's form the task force, let's get some experts in the room, let's talk about what this means, and then in the context of the Southern California Water Coalition, then we'll chart a course for what do we do, how do we do it, and at what pace. And so today, I'm very pleased to introduce our expert panel, and as I introduce each of you, if you would please come up and have a seat at our table. First, I'd like to introduce co-chair, and you know him because he's been on our board. He has chaired our Colorado River Task Force for, I don't know, what, about 3 years now? But when this issue came up, I had a nice chat with Anatole Falagan, and Anatole is very passionate about this issue of equity, access, and affordability. So Anatole, if you do not know him, is the Assistant General Manager for the Long Beach Water Department. And he is responsible, and I just like this, Anatole, financial management, water resources, government and public affairs, human resources, technology operations, land and lease management, and safety administration. Which leads me to ask the question, what does Chris Garner do? Anatole previously served at the Metropolitan Water District. He began his career, he came west. I think a lot of people now are going back east, Anatole, but he came west from Texas, where he holds a BS and an MS in civil engineering from Stanford and an MBA, Jose, near Irvine. Jose? Irvine. Fear the snow. Our other co-chair is new to the Southern California Water Coalition, but not new to community service. Acquanetta Warren is Fontana's first female and first African-American mayor, and is very passionate about local government, where she is part of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the California League of Cities. She does a lot of things focusing on public safety, business, job creation, educational opportunities, and health and happy communities. What I find also interesting, and you'll find this theme throughout each of our distinguished panel today. She earned her bachelor's in urban studies from Occidental College. So we got a lot of really highly educated people here, Occidental College, and she holds an honorary doctorate of theology from Next Dimension Bible College, and she is a member, how apropos for today, she's a member of the Water of Life Community Church. What better qualifications could you have to be in a water coalition? So we welcome Acquanetta. Also with us today, Kurt Schwabe, who's an adjunct fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. PPIC has been an active partner with this organization for many years, and he is a professor of environmental economics and policy at University of California, Riverside. His research, and he's got papers like any good professor at a UC system, they make you publish on quite a regular basis, don't they?
They try.
Okay, so he has a very long list of publications and awards in his research, but I also just want to share with you again the part of the theme. He has a PhD in economics from North Carolina State University, an MA in economics from Duke University, and because he's a show-off, he double majored in math and economics at Falagan College. So he's an overachiever. Thank you. And he also promised that he'd be the one to answer all questions on math. And to round out our panel today, Danielle Coates. Danielle is the Senior Legislative Program Manager for the Eastern Municipal Water District, where she is the Senior Legislative Program Manager with the Public Policy and Governmental Affairs Department. She is our government expert. This lady has been on the forefront of the pending regulatory and legislative issues around this equity, access, and affordability arena. And she is absolutely steeped in what some of the statewide public policymakers are thinking about. A lot of creative ideas, and she gets to be the one to hold up the sun and say, well, let's talk about that. Prior to joining Eastern Municipal, Danielle worked in government affairs with the Western Riverside Council of Governments. So she is expert in local government and with water agencies, is very active with a variety of other associations. We welcome Danielle Coates. It's okay to clap. So as I indicated when we started our discussion, we sort of invited these folks to come in and be part of our program and be part of the formation of this task force. And so, Anatole, I'd like to start with you at the very far end of the table since I introduced you first. But in our conversation, I just wanted to sort of tee it up with, how do you perceive, sort of from your professional standpoint, and then what you have sort of seen over the last few years as the issue has developed, how do you view this issue of equity, access, and affordability? How does that fit in your mind into the kind of bigger picture of water and water providership?
So the engineer doesn't know how to turn the mic on.
You're on mute.
Yeah. The engineer figured it out.
This is why we have an IT department. Your guys are not here.
Yes. They always take care of me. Well, good afternoon, everybody. To me, I was just talking to Kurt right now at the table, and we were talking about this aspect of equity, affordability, and access. And part of our commentary that we had in our conversation is, I think increasingly for us, it's important that we recognize that we understand perhaps some dimensions of this issue now, but I think we all know, because of our experience in this water world, that it's not a static picture. In Southeast Los Angeles County, a community that we are a participant in as the city of Long Beach, PFAS and PFOA is taking over as a critical water quality issue. And you may find well-established water utilities dealing with this issue, and that's going to put stress and strain on them. So while we go through things that we acutely are aware of, as we heard from Laurel Firestone in a presentation today, on things that are happening in the Central Valley, perhaps things that have already made the front page of the headlines in Southeast Los Angeles County, it's important to understand that as we try to address these challenges, they are not static, they are changing. And of course, we may be all well and good in one instance, and then all of a sudden find ourselves under stress from these issues of equity and affordability and access, because so many things can happen to us. Water quality is constantly changing.
Well, Acquanetta, you come at this from a slightly different perspective. In your role in local government, you kind of see things in a slightly different way, although you do know and worked around water. But how does this issue sort of resonate within your sphere of influence and what you're seeing with your colleagues in city government?
I think it's important to understand, particularly for the city of Fontana, we don't own any water company. We are at the mercy, now this is a bad thing, of other water companies that serve our public. And initially, our city spent a lot of time in litigation with those individuals fighting about water rates. When I became mayor, I decided maybe we need to sit down and talk and see where we can partner. Because basically, we are under the PUC, they make those decisions, as well as the ratepayer task force up at that level allegedly speaks on our behalf. And as a result, we decided we needed to work together on infrastructure. What does that mean to this particular space and discussion? Is that in cities, we see it from the perspective, we have to just make sure when people turn on the hydrant, it works. But what we've got to do is start reaching beyond that and worry more about the infrastructure. And we were just talking at the table, we should not have been at the same table. We resolved the world right there at that table. We're really critically involved in the infrastructure where the meter is. We've got to start looking at the homes and the businesses, because unless people trust water and unless we can provide reliability, we will never see equity. Never. And when we talk about equity, we always think in relations to race, and it's a major portion of it, but it's also an ability to work together on all issues related to all utilities. And it's also an opportunity to develop more diversity in these companies. There's something about somebody sitting at the table that looks like the person they're serving that can make a big difference, a big, big difference. I'll give you a great example that I think people are beginning to cross the lines, and not in a bad way. I was one of the first WELLOs, which is the water education for Latino leaders. When I first went to that meeting, all the Latino leaders were looking at me like, what you doing up in here? Because there's no secret I grew up 2 blocks out of Watts in South Central Los Angeles. But the beauty was, Victor Gago said, Acquanetta services over 72% Latinos in her city. She is a Latino leader. And we've got to start looking in that realm. And we've got to start accepting each other. And we've got to make sure that we walk the talk. It's important. If we start to sit down and look at our structures and make sure we understand how the water flows, what are the issues, how do we make it fair for everyone, how do we sustain the prices that our public is having to endure, how do we train them? We've got a drought right at our front door. We still have elected leaders not understanding it's coming. Wake up. Do something about it. We've got to make sure we talk. That's the way cities look at it. We have to deliver, and when we have to pull on our companies that provide, it's because we've got to provide to the public.
All right. Yeah. All right, so Dr. Schwabe, in all of those papers that you've written, somewhere you've come up with all the answers, because I just heard at the table you have solved this issue before we even got formed.
No, I've got to continue to raise questions, otherwise I'm out of a job, right? So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel, this discussion. It's obviously an extremely important, vital, critical, complex, and interesting discussion. And this is why, to some extent, I find it kind of interesting and important. I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today just in the 4.5 minutes I have left. And I thought about 3 Ds for my talk, was distributions, diversity, and data. And I'll get through these pretty quickly. Distributions, economists, people tend to focus on averages. And averages, if you remember, is just one metric. It's one summary statistic of a whole distribution. And I think we tend to overlook the tails of the distribution. This came home to roost for me 11 years ago when I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I thought the median didn't represent my survival probabilities. And if any of you have cancer or friends that have cancer, a great article was written by evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, also avid Red Sox fan, and it's called "The Median is Not the Message." And he argues in his case, too, that the 8 months that the doctor gave him was a really poor representation of the distribution he was in. He was in the right tail of the distribution by far. He lived for 20 years and died of something else. So how does this relate to affordability? One of the big issues is how do you measure it and what's in that denominator? We don't want to use averages. I think that misses the point. We want to look at lower income households, we want to look at 20 percentile income, low income households, however you want to look at it, but averages, I believe, are missing the point. That's distribution. The second thing is diversity, and diversity in terms of portfolios and strategies. I know a number of you through previous research looking at how to reduce water use through diversified price and non-price approaches. And we find time and time again when you use diversified approaches as opposed to a single approach, it's less costly, it's efficient, and it's more sustainable, and more reliable too. Henry Markowitz, back in 1952, won a Nobel Prize in economics looking at diversified portfolio theory and how you reduce the trade-offs, risk-return trade-offs if you have a diversified portfolio. How does it relate to this discussion? We're not going to solve it with one pricing instrument. We're not going to solve it with one subsidy. We're going to really look broadly at the range of ways to reduce costs, but also interact perhaps horizontally with other institutions that provide essential services, and look at interacting vertically with other agencies, state, county agencies, in solving this. That's the way to come to an efficient, cost-effective, and sustainable solution. And my third is data, and by that I mean evidence. There's plenty of evidence now in the research about kind of how price and non-price instruments can perhaps reduce water use, although I'm always willing to be paid for doing another study. But there's a dearth of evidence in terms of issues associated with affordability, and in that sense, we don't really know a lot about what we mean by affordability, what are the consequences on affordability that we should care about, and how do different strategies affect affordability. And just two things I think would be really interesting is thinking about what is affordability. There's no one definition here. We kind of wrestle over it, right? What should be in the numerator, what should be in the denominator. What I think would be really interesting is think of an outcome that we all agree on that probably is related to people that can't afford water, perhaps delinquencies, and look at which one of those metrics seem to best describe that, right? Controlling for everything else, right? It's not just income. Right? You got to think about the cost of living and everything, but throw that ratio on the right-hand side, the different measures of that ratio, and see which one seems to provide the best goodness of fit. That will help us move along, and I think, in that discussion. The second issue is what are the consequences of these programs? And I can't find any real good study that looks at the consequences of these affordability programs besides saying we gave people more money or they reduced their water bill, which I think is really important. But for me, I don't think it's enough. I think we should look at outcomes that matter to us, health outcomes, per se. So, for instance, I have data from a different study looking at birth weights, 20 million birth weights, every birth in California over the last so many years. Why not look at how people and programs that adopt LEAR rates, look at, does it affect birth weights? Does it reduce anxiety and resources available to pregnant mothers, right? Or psychological distress? Look at explaining, for those agencies or people that are in these programs, does it seem to matter to the things that we really care about? And I challenge you to find a study that's done that. It's good that we're having this discussion that we give reductions in water bills, but my question is, how much does it matter, and what programs seem to matter more than the others? And I think that through what I'm suggesting here, you can get at that. Thank you.
There's a lot to think about and very thorough. So taking that then, Danielle, as I introduced you, state, federal, other government officials have never been criticized for not being creative. And as things hit the front page of a newspaper, it tends to get a lot of focus. You've had the opportunity over the last few years to sort of focus on what they're thinking about, what rises to that level, and then, the old cascade effect. It's like, we'll just make it so, but you guys at the local level have to implement it. What kinds of things have you seen, or are you seeing at the state level and at the national level, legislatively and regulatorily, that kind of contribute, or something we should be really thinking about here as we look at this issue?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Absolutely. I joined Eastern in 2011, the year before the legislature passed the human right to water. So I literally fell into this conversation almost immediately. And as Eastern started to get engaged through the accessibility and the affordability conversations, we were really approached at the local level through the County Department of Public Health to take over a failing water system, a system that we didn't even know at the time existed. So I think that goes a lot to understanding and identifying where those systems actually are and what the complex nature of what those local systems entail. So through that process, we introduced legislation because we were asked to consolidate that system. And we passed the SB 1130 with Senator Roth. And what that sought to do was advance some liability protections for the two water systems, Eastern and Elsinore Valley Municipal Water District, that sought to take over that failing water system. So those assurances really made strides in facilitating that consolidation. And the state looked at that effort and realized that that is also an issue that is applied elsewhere. So they took that legislation and they embedded it into SB 88, which, as we all know, is the mandatory consolidation legislation. At the time, it was very controversial and very groundbreaking. Since that time, there's been many iterations of the consolidation discussion, but I think it's Eastern's involvement in the Small System Water Authority Act that really elevated our understanding of the issue. And for those of you that don't know what the Small System Water Authority Act, it was a multi-year legislative effort that Eastern undertook with the California Municipal Utilities Association, and it was authored by Senator Ana Caballero. We hadn't been successful to get that over the finish line, but what we did is understand the problem quite a bit more, look at the economies of scale, look at the dynamics and all the issues that lead to what could facilitate both a failing system as well as what the solution can entail. So long story short, what we've learned through this process, I think, is that not all the solutions are on the table, that there is a lot left in this conversation, that there's a lot of areas to be innovative. When we look to additional conversations in the future, I think a lot of those solutions are not only going to just come from the legislature, state or federal, it's going to come from the people on the ground, the locals, the local governments, the water districts, but also the local government partners. There's a lot of interrelated action in between all these issues, the equity conversation, accessibility, and certainly affordability. They're absolutely interrelated, and unless you can kind of understand what the factors are that contribute to each of those pieces, I think we're going to have a hard time understanding the whole.
So, and I want you, any of you, to jump in on this, but I'm going to come back to Anatole for the moment because, you know, you and I, when we first talked again, and Laurel mentioned it, you know, there's a lot of focus on this issue in the Central Valley. And we went through the entire discussion about, you know, funding systems and inadequate water systems, and, you know, but it was all Central Valley, and board member Firestone comes out of the Central Valley. That's what she's passionate about. But with that, you know, we're talking about Southern California. You know, where are there, how do we address the pockets, the areas within our own region? We think is the big, you know, good news, we're really big and really diverse. Bad news, we're really big and we're really diverse. Ask, you know, anybody in Riverside or San Bernardino County. These are giant, you know, land entities with lots of different kinds of communities in them. How do we, or is it really important to talk about Central Valley versus, or is there a way to get kind of generally at this as that local agency trying to help meet need?
That was a really long question. So let me.
So, and you need to provide an answer that's about 3 times as long as the question.
Oh, no. They're going to leave. I think, you know, what you posed, Charlie, is an important dynamic to what I see as a way to find common ground on this issue, because if not, we're going to find ourselves talking about different elements of the state and perhaps say that it does or doesn't apply to our area. I think in the region in Southern California, and my career being here in Southern California, it is not untrue that the things that you find happening in Central Valley in terms of access, because that becomes like the dominant discussion, it's important not to lose sight that the fundamental elements of equity, affordability, and access are not distinguished by geographic region. We do experience that here in Southern California in different elements. And I want to bring forward, if I may, a certain aspect that I think will be important for the task force going forward, that I want to bring in, and that is the lens or the paradigm or the framework off of which we talk about these things. And Acquanetta knows because we were on a panel together, and I chose to talk about it in this framework. So I want to share it with you, that when it comes to these dimensions of issues, right, and even I'm using the terminology, the State Water Board member, Laurel Firestone, she brought an interesting aspect in the way she was describing it. She used the word challenge. And I want you to remember that word for a moment, because in our coffee table discussions that we have with so many people, when we talk about equity, affordability, and access, invariably, I think, as we're talking to people, somebody might come and tell you that, you know, human right to water is a problem. It's an issue. And rightfully so, somebody on the other side of the coffee table will come out and say, I don't really understand why human right to water is a problem or an issue. The language and the law is pretty clear, and it's pretty hard to argue why people would not have a human right to water. So I don't understand why it's a problem or an issue. Somebody else might come at it at the coffee table, they're hearing the conversation, and they jump in, and they say, well, you know, it's kind of complicated, the human right to water and this access and affordability. It's just complicated. And somebody at the coffee table might come forward and say, I don't see what's complicated about it at all. To provide water, you need infrastructure. You need to sink wells. A lot of common source of local water is groundwater, is sinking wells. And people pretty much know how to sink wells. And if there's something that has to be treated in the water, engineers are pretty good at coming up with treatment systems. They attach them to the wells, and then they put it into the pipes, and the water goes to the meter, and it goes to the home. So it doesn't seem very complicated at all. Okay, so I think that's a dimension coming forward, and it resonates with Laurel Firestone's comment that we heard, which had to do with it's a challenge, right? Because it's not a problem, it's not an issue, it's not complicated, it's complex. And on our panel and the discussion we have heard today, this word starts to emanate on complex and complexity. And I think fundamentally as we go forward, that's one of the critical elements here on how to deal with this challenge, is that it's the complexity. Complexity in the groundwater, the water quality, complexity in how the different institutions come together, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're already an existing water utility, a small system, all of these layers trying to work together, that's a really complex situation to address this challenge. And in that complexity, that's what you need to work on to find the elements that guide you or shape pathways to solutions.
Anybody else have comments to Anatole? Because I got an immediate follow-up if not, because that's a very interesting statement. Danielle?
I would just like to build off of some of the specifics of what makes this issue complex. Now, the needs assessment that was recently put out by the State Water Resources Control Board identified 331 failing water systems, 617 water systems that were at risk, 77,973 water system, domestic wells that were at high risk of failure. These are big numbers. These are facilities and water systems that are throughout the state, many of them in very rural and remote areas. This is definitely an issue that people are very passionate about. We all have already declared that every single person has the right to safe and affordable and reliable drinking water. So how do we make good on that promise? And I think to Anatole's point, this is a very complex problem, but it is a problem that has solutions, and I think part of those solutions will be prioritizing those systems, those water systems that are of greatest need, that are failing to provide that basic need of safe and reliable drinking water. So I just wanted to tag that in there.
Yeah. So, Acquanetta?
You know, of course, I lost my voice last week and still can't get it back. But I think what happens, you don't have champions. I've been giving this a great deal of thought, and you'll probably come out here and say, I can't believe she said that. I can't believe she's comparing this issue to the Marvel heroes. But it comes down to people caring enough to talk about, from a level of leadership, that this is a problem. When I'm around my colleagues, other mayors and council people, we're talking about a lot of glamorous things. We're not talking about water infrastructure. And that's where it all begins. When I sit down and talk to people across the nation, it never comes up. What about water infrastructure? And what happens is, once it becomes a problem and starts to collapse, then we start saying, you know what? This might be a little bit better than some flower pots in the downtown area. But I'm being serious. We need more champions like all of you to educate those that make the decisions on where the priorities are for infrastructure. Central Valley got it before we did Southern California. They realized they needed it for their algaculture, their livestock. And by the way, our good friend, I won't name him, you all know who he is when I say this, keeps telling me, stop giving water to the beef and we'll have a lot of water. That means we have to stop eating so much beef. But think about it. We've got to educate the decision makers on how important the water structure is, not just in the Central Valley, but throughout this state, throughout this nation. Until you begin to get it to be a priority, equity, access, reliability means nothing because people still don't understand we're in trouble. Central Valley went out of their way to market that they're in trouble. Southern California has the beach. There's the difference right there. We don't talk about it enough. We don't focus on it enough. And we won't until we go to the water hydrant and it doesn't turn on.
Well, we've been down that road with the electric system. That didn't work out so very well. But let me ask, okay, Kurt, we got an engineer, and we got a mathematician and an economics major. We can design most anything. Can't you just make it affordable?
Well, someone has to pay, and that's a really challenging and complex question often about who decides to pay in this type of democracy that we have and the way our water districts are set up, our institutions are set up. So I think that's something that hopefully the task force will really look into, and is to say who, what part of the bill, maybe, or how much of the bill should different institutions be on the hook for. So it's not that we can't provide cheap water to somebody. We can, but it has to be paid by somebody and something. And so in that sense, yeah, we can do it. And then there's the how do we roll it out in an effective manner so that everyone who's eligible to receive this actually gets it. And I think right now our self-selection procedures or voluntary procedures typically don't get above, let's say on average, 30% adoption in these programs. So the people that are supposed to benefit from them typically don't, and therefore the average cost of these programs are much higher per person than they should be.
Anatole?
Yeah, in terms of this challenge and the complexity, I think that from what you've heard here, it really, infrastructure underpins the discussion of how to deal with this complex challenge. And there's other dimensions to infrastructure that are important for us to talk about, and hopefully the task force will bring these different elements together. In other forums, I've tried to share with people that when we talk about infrastructure, it's important that there's funding infrastructure, there's building infrastructure, there's operating infrastructure, and there's maintaining infrastructure. These dimensions of water quality fundamentally that we've seen in challenges up and across the state, as we talk about how to deal with them, address that complexity, me as an engineer with my background, I just gravitate to the issue of infrastructure just as a matter of course. But in my career and my background, I also then focus on the other element, which is the institutional requirements, regulatory requirements, and then the financial, what I call the institutional lift. The institution that does this lifting, so to speak, financially, to fund it, there's an equal institutional lift to build it. There's an equal institutional lift to operate it, because in order to maintain water quality in the system, you have to be doing things operationally that come with its own requirements. And then in order to maintain it, because you have to maintain it, that's additional things. And so when it comes to affordability, then the task force hopefully will begin to be a forum to bring these perspectives is when it comes to water infrastructure, the 20th century focus has been on rates, really comfortable. Infrastructure, water rates support infrastructure. But in the dialogue of this complexity of challenge that comes to equity, affordability, and accessibility, we're going to have to deal with this element of how do you match up financial and funding requirements to this infrastructure need in order to address these issues of equity, access, and affordability. And in that dimension, rates is only one way to do it. There's multiple ways to do it, and hopefully the task force will begin to explore that going forward.
So, well, that leads me then to that sort of that next obvious question you touched on when we began. How much of this is politics? How much of this is issue problem solving? And can you get to issue problem solving given sort of the rhetoric that tends to rise to the top that, my own observation, doesn't tend to be very constructive anymore. It's very vitriolic. How do you get through that? Is it a political issue, or is this really a problem solving issue?
It is a political issue, but we've got to move it to problem solving. It doesn't matter what your party is. It doesn't matter what your race is. Everybody human, animals, grass, everything needs water. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine the other night about the fires, and I thought about the drought. I said the first thing people want to do when you say drought, stop watering their grass. Then they wonder why their house burned down faster. Or the side of the hill they live in back of burned down faster. It's all about understanding how this all works together. And we never get on the whiteboard and put all the issues up. You know, my great friend, Supervisor Rutherford, I used to love when she was on council with me because she let us all talk. And then she'd bring us back around to the issue. And she'd say, we all said the same thing, but how do we get down that road? And that's what we're missing. I'm mad at you because of something you did last week or last month, or you didn't endorse me. Do you think I'm gonna sit down at the table with you, try to solve a problem now? We've gotta educate our citizens. They've gotta understand this is important too. And we gotta listen to them. We gotta figure out where everybody is. And I cannot stress enough, this task force, I'm looking forward to it. Because we talk about diversity, we run out and hire a bunch of black people, and then we wonder why no black people stay. Because we don't know how to treat people, because they don't fit our mode of the type of workers we want to have. We're starting to see the need to address that. It's just like, why recruit police officers of different colors and then don't know how to treat them and they don't stay as officers? Nobody ever asks for the table or the matrix on retention. They just get up in front of everybody. I hired 5 black people, I hired 3 Mexicans, I hired 5 Filipinos, but they can't tell you in a year if they're still there. All of this comes with us sitting down and identifying where the problem is, how do we solve it, and listen to the people most impacted. Everybody in this room knows about water, and that's fine and dandy, but do you know about people? And that's what's gonna make the difference.
I would just like to weigh in. I do think there are clearly elements of politics to the conversation, but I also think that we have to look at what the drivers are. What is making the water more expensive? And these are the external pressures on our water system. Those are the regulatory challenges that we all face, the purchasing and developing new water supplies, the operations and maintenance, certainly, all the things that make for modern day water service to be available. And then we also have to look at how those pressures extend to the community and then ultimately down to the household. Once we start having data on where all those pressure points are, I think we can cut through a lot of the politics and get to the root of the issue and find those solutions that are so critical.
So I'm going to ask this question because this is the audience participation part, just because, you know, as we're talking about politics here. How many of you in the room are elected or appointed officials? Most of you, okay? We've got a couple of county elected officials. We know that you're well accustomed to vitriolic constituents coming in with opinions, and there's a way that you need to be able to listen and to go through that. But of those that are water district board members, I mean, let's just call it what it is. If 3 people showed up at your board meeting talking about your rate case, which of you start freaking out looking at the door? And so I ask the question, you know, when politics comes home, to Acquanetta's point about the ability then to engage, are we doing enough as water agencies and water constituents to engage our public as to what the value of our service is? Acquanetta?
You're not. You're not, and it's not something I haven't told some of you to your face. You've got to begin using those grants for education of water use to educate the public on how important this issue is. You can't just get elected 3 times and say, I did my job. You've got to engage the public, and you've got to worry about more than them having a good garden or rocks in their front yard. You've got to train them about their pipes and how that impacts their ability to deliver water in their home. You've got to talk to them about the types of roofs and different things they're using in their home. You got to tell them, you live in a green belt, but maybe it's time to get some rock sand over there, so you don't have to use so much water. And now all of you want to go up on the recycled water. I'm just shaking my head looking at this. You tell us, let's get purple pipe in the ground, and you see an opportunity to make more money. We're all fighting trying to get infrastructure funds, and we want to make those infrastructure funds a priority for water and sewer because, God forbid, our state give a hoot about it. So it's really important that you think about why you wanted to be on those water boards. And that was to make sure there was equity, access, and reliability. And you need to take that message to the people that you serve so they are on the same page as you. Because if you don't do that, the more we get educated as electeds, we're going to come after you. Because Lord knows, I'm not going to take the fall on this one.
Danielle, please, anybody brave enough to follow that statement?
I'm going to take it and go around it a little bit, but I think as water providers, we're really tasked with looking out for the ratepayers that we serve to make sure that A, they have safe and affordable, reliable water, and B, they're able to pay for it, right? So those are things that we're essentially tasked for. So it takes a lot to go beyond that and look up and say, okay, there's a big problem out there where there's areas throughout the state that safe and reliable and accessible water is not something that everyone has. So it goes beyond what you're necessarily tasked with to go above and beyond to look at these other external factors. So I think and then furthermore, when we hear conversations like we did earlier today, where we have the regulatory bodies say this is not just a pipe and engineering issue. And certainly there is a component and there is a place for the pipe and the engineering solutions. And I think there has to be more of an invitation, more of a push towards engaging those water providers to provide those solutions, because we certainly hear that there's a lot of public engagement needed, and that is absolutely true. You have to engage the public on the solutions that are going to be benefiting them. But you also cannot ignore those innovators, those experts in the field that are able to develop the water supplies, that are able to provide the innovative treatment solutions, that are able to deliver the solutions that are needed to provide safe and affordable and reliable water. So I think we all need to come to the table. And there are some that want to exclude others, but it's absolutely imperative that there's water providers there, there's LAFCOs there, there's local government, there's experts in every field at the table, interested, willing, and capable to participate in the conversation.
Sounds super easy, Danielle.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Kurt?
So I kind of think of the evolution of water issues. And originally it was a supply issue. We went out and got more supply. And then more in the last 20 years, it's been a demand issue. Let's manage demand. Now I think it's a public relations issue that we got to put a lot more attention into. And I was interviewed by Gary Feitzer from Western Water about a month ago. And he asked me, why did water rates go up so much? And I was too flippant with my first response. I said, because they're so low. And I said, no, don't print that. Don't print that. This is bad. For the water agencies I work with, they are really low, I have to say. And right, for the water agencies I work with, they are really low. But I said, listen, $10 to $20 is a 100% increase, right? But it's $10 to $20 versus $100 to $110. But I said, really, I think the important question is, what are you getting for that rate increase, right? And if you look at what Southern California has done with that rate increase, it's really, really impressive. I mean, it's really something that, the rest of the world should look at, and I think they do, in terms of the reliability, the increase in supply, the reduction in per capita per day usage and such like that. With all these investments, right? It seems like a really good bargain. That doesn't mean it's affordable for some people. But boy, you've done a great job in that sense. But one day I went around and decided to pre-test a survey instrument with for a survey I was doing for one of the agencies, and rather than send my graduate students out there, I decided to put on the old walking shoes and give it the old college try. Boy, I had a hard time getting to households, getting on the front lawns. People thought they're price gouging us, right? And maybe it was just a select group I was interviewing in these areas. But I just was, holy cow, I understand why kind of price is going up. They're not price gouging. They got to cover costs. They can't make profits, at least the agencies I'm working with right now. They wouldn't hear it. And so it made me realize, boy, there's got to be more money into public relations, I hear. So anyways, I'll stop there. Sorry about that.
I think we got time. Anatole, go ahead.
Yeah, on the affordability, one of the things, talking to my task force members here, one of the things that I think is important going forward is that, just like I tried to characterize infrastructure for you, that it had many different dimensions, affordability itself has many different dimensions too. And that's equally important for us, not just for the challenges that we're seeing on human right to water and equity and access, but challenges across the board for all utilities. And there's that element of affordability, like we pointed out, is like, well, the rates are low. So that's affordability. Well, affordability is in context, right? And so if we have certain communities that with medium income or some other measurements, that the disparity between that household income and then that particular rate, that's one measure of affordability. There's another element of affordability is that when we deal with things in providing safe, clean, and reliable water to communities, there's choices that we have to make going forward, and invariably they're going to require more infrastructure and more resources. And let's say that we get to those situations and we present that need. This is the next step for us in the water community. We need to do this. And this is what's going to hypothetically happen to your bill when we make that decision. If we're not careful, that discussion comes forward and it says, well, that's not affordable. Well, the dimension there is that if I present it to you and I don't present to you the alternative and explain to you what the alternative costs, then we're really not having a good, solid, elementary discussion of affordability. Again, never mind these elements of where other funding might come besides rates, just simply talking about the rates. There's another element that has come forward in the discussion of major infrastructure investments in California, is when we talk to the public about it and we try to give them a sense of things, invariably, and not very good in terms of public relations, we say, oh, it's only $5 a month. That was a bad way to get started on this conversation. It's only, underscore only, bad choice of words, $5 a month, and then the tone in which it's delivered is, how could you care about $5? I've been in public discussion sessions under public comment where people have come forward and said, I don't know what $5 means to you, but let me explain to you what $5 means to me. And it's definitely not Starbucks. The person literally said, I'm lucky if I go to the donut shop and grab coffee and a glazed donut for $1 when I can afford it. So don't tell me what $5 is or is not to me. But that, to the discussion of public relations, was a failure because it was not portrayed in the aspect of context of what the option is. And then knowing what that challenge is of $5 a month, what are we as the water community going to do about that if we don't put it on the rates? Can we find another way to not put it on the rates? Can we find grant funding, bond funding, loan? Can we do something, right? There's all these different dimensions to affordability that I'm hopeful the task force will get to explore and maybe do some white papers on in discussion, because After all, we're blessed to have a mathematician and an economist with us at the
And an
table.
author.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to ask this question in transition. Julie has a microphone, and I'm going to play dangerous, where I've facilitated a conversation today, but we got time, about 5 minutes left, so if there take like if there are super burning questions on something that you just got to get out and we haven't touched, because again, we're trying to be fairly generic here, because we really don't know what it is we're going to attack. But while you're raising hands, if there is anybody, what I'm hearing is that we've done too good a job delivering reliable water to the point that people, it's not high on their awareness list. It's not something that they think about every day. Are we doing too good a job delivering? And I hear we're not doing a good job educating and communicating. We need to do better there. But, you know, like we had a lot of attention around electricity a few years ago and again last year because the lights went out. Does the water need to go out? Does somebody need to turn that tap in some of these larger urban communities and say, hey, you know what? Today's not your day. Does that get the attention that we need?
Turn off the water at Starbucks.
Turn off the water at Starbucks. We can start there. I mean, that would send ripples through the economy. Not sure Acquanetta City is going to want to see that revenue decline. Are we too good at our job?
Don't forget pass-through, too. That's another bad word. Bad word, pass-through.
Pierre always has a question. Pierre Swan.
So easy to use.
We've talked all around the issue of affordability. Okay, so you've talked all the way around the affordability of it, and people in this room, many of the people in this room are working overtime to put online very expensive projects that are taking water away, sales away from Met, which forces Met to raise their rates. So we're not coordinating what we're doing well as an industry, and we're unnecessarily making, you know, water more expensive than it needs to be in this service area down in Southern California. In the Central Valley, it appears that there's not the core competency or the ability to afford to operate, much less pay for improvements to the water supply there. But the people in this room have the core competency to help them solve that problem that they don't have. So they need that help. So we haven't matched things up very well, and we haven't thought through what we're doing to ourselves and others to get to affordable water and safe and reliable water for all. Thank you.
All right, no question. Mr. Jones.
Thank you. Appreciate the panelists coming today. Y'all made really wonderful comments. One of the things I want to hear the panelists talk about a little bit is affordability and accessibility in Southern California is different than it is in other parts of the state. And if you look at the state's needs assessment, they've analyzed and identified over 330 failing community water systems that also are having affordability issues as well as water quality and other issues. There's 3,000 water systems in the state of California. And is part of the problem that in some of the areas that are most affected, and by the way, I think 80% of the systems on that failing system list have less than 1,000 service connections. They're all very, very small systems. So do we have a governance problem here where we don't have the capacity, technical, managerial, financial capacity, when you have a system that has 25 service connections to bring themselves into compliance and to do so affordably for their customers?
I'm happy to take that one. I absolutely believe, as Eastern Municipal Water District, the former sponsor of the Small System Water Authority Act, that looked at the economies of scale issue, that looked at merging multiple small failing water systems. I definitely, I think there was a lot of validity to that conversation. I think there is a lot of conversation that needs to be had on what governance that can sustain a viable water system looks like and what all the needs are that go into that governance structure. I think that, I think the 414, the Small System Water Authority Act, I thought it brought around a lot of really good conversation. I think there's a recognition that is starting to emerge that there was a lot of validity to that effort. And if you look at the State Water Resources Control Board's needs assessment, there is a supplement that outlines a discussion on regionalization. And specifically, they did some site-specific analysis of the issues, and one of the areas they looked at is Monterey, and they looked at what could potentially happen if they regionalized 85 small water systems. And this concept, it's a traditional consolidation where there was one viable water system. They were looking to merge 85 smaller water systems. Well, to Paul's point, a lot of those systems had under 100 connections. So it's not like you're building a massive water system. You're looking at probably still only about 8,500 connections, but you're able to develop the economies of scale that allow for those systems to be viable and that allow for the attraction of the staff that can run those water systems more competently. And in the environment of more broadband for all, you can even look at innovative solutions such as remote monitoring. So absolutely, governance has to be on the table. I think there's, again, a lot of innovation that can happen in this area, and I think the State Board is possibly coming around to some of these conversations.
Anatole?
Yeah, Paul brings up an excellent point, and Eastern has had some experience with this as well in terms of consolidation. In the brief time that we have, I'd ask you to walk through this example with me that I'm going to lay out for you as I've seen the issues unfold in the Central Valley. And some of this might be, I confess, it might be in the state needs assessment. Paul reminded me that it's 300 pages long, and I confess I haven't read all of it yet. But follow me on this, if you will. I know through a colleague of mine in a network that I'm in called the Water Solutions Network. This colleague of mine was advocating for the joining, if you will, or annexing a small community system, disadvantaged, historically disadvantaged and set aside, predominantly Hispanic farm worker community, water quality contaminated well, and they wanted to join a more well-established white Central Valley community, and the video was all about this person's effort to try to get them accepted into the larger system. And mind you, you were talking about governance issue. They were approaching it strictly from the governance standpoint, and quite literally, if you watch the video, it's, I think you should make us part of your system. No. I think you should make us part of your system. Can we have a vote? Yes, we'll vote. No. You're about to do your master plan. Can you do your master plan to have us join your system and address our issues with water quality? We did our master plan. The answer is no. Well, that's true. But in these issues of equity, affordability, and accessibility, I wonder, just wondering, if there was actually the opportunity for a well to be located with a particular yield, and that well's yield would actually satisfy the 100 connections or so of the small community, but adding that well's yield would help the more functioning system maintain its well capacity and its maintenance and give them greater flexibility in operating and maintaining their system, would that help the bigger system? And the answer is probably yes. But for that bigger system, we run into Proposition 218. And the bigger system would say, well, those 100 small connections, they need to pick up this cost for the well. Well, back to these issues that we started this conversation with, that's really hard to do. I mean, 100 connections trying to finance the issue of a well and so forth with their rates, in which case some of them don't even have rates. They just simply have a monthly charge. They can't do it. Okay, but what if you told the community, hey, I can get you money for the well. I can actually help you in all aspects to sink that well. It's going to benefit you and benefit the 100 connections. And if you would only take them in, you get the funding for the well. But if you don't take them in, you don't get the funding for the well. And if you get the funding for the well and we can do something else, maybe I can get you funding for the operations and maintenance of that well going forward. Now that community starts to see the other community in a totally different light, because that small community is an incentivized aspect to have infrastructure development, which is a benefit for the larger community, right? And so I think fundamentally in the conversation we've had in the past few minutes, this is one of the dynamics that we talk about going forward, which is collaboration and cooperation amongst many different institutions is really the pathway forward, rather than to think of it singularly as, well, someone has to step up and do this by themselves. It's actually the cooperation. And here in Southern California, back to the topic for our task force in our region, there's already a lot of well-established institutions. So the challenge may be to get them to collaborate and cooperate and move forward, rather than thinking that someone has to do this lift all by themselves.
Well, I think those are perfect words for us to bring this afternoon's program to an end. Would you please help me in thanking our panel? You know, as I sit here and I go through this kind of at that 30,000-foot level, I mean, what I heard today was we've been challenged, and there are challenges. We need to be willing to accept the challenge. We need to find champions within that challenge. And I'm actually going to look to the four of you, and for those that would like to join these four in becoming champions on this issue, we will welcome you to be a part of this task force as we design a specific program and action plan that we can take forward. I heard that language matters and that we have to find a way to resonate with the constituencies, all of whom you are responsible for, but we may have an ability to help provide tools and programs to let you do that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, whether we're talking about the Bay Delta estuary, we're talking about equity, access, and affordability, coalition development is critical. And I'm hearing, at least at this organization, because of its diversity of members and region, we are well suited to bring those kind of coalition elements together. And at the end of the day, whether you're talking local district or we're talking regional, you got to do the work. And we got to roll up our sleeves. So I welcome those of you that are willing to roll up your sleeves and help us do the work to join our Equity, Access, and Affordability Task Force. And I look forward to being a part of our program going forward. Thank you all very much. Have a safe drive home.